many questions I'm asked about the Kindertransport, there are two that I would like to share with you. One of the two I will not reveal right now. Hopefully, at the Q&A after my short presentation, someone will ask me that question, and if they do, I will identify it. And if I'm not asked it, then at the end of the Q&A, I would like someone to remind me. The other question is a very logical one. Why now? Why did I write this book now? After all, the Kindertransport happened a long time ago, in 1938. I partially answered this question in the foreword of my book, but there were other reasons that I did not go into, and which I will mention now. First of all, I never thought I had the right to write a book that was Holocaust-related, simply because I never considered myself a survivor, and I still don't. After the war, I met many survivors of the camps, and as the years went by, I read many accounts by Elie Wiesel, Primo Levi, and others, people who were and are real survivors. What a chutzpah it would be of me to try and write anything. I'm reminded of a story, I believe it's a true story, that was told me some years ago, when the old Satmar Rebbe was ailing and near death. His Hasidim came to him and asked him, Rebbe, who will we go to for bracha, for blessing, when you are no longer with us? And the Satmar Rebbe told them, go to any mourning venue, and if you see a man with a number on his arm and who's putting tefillin on, that is the person from whom you should seek a bracha. I know there are people in this room who are survivors, real survivors, and if there are, I apologize to you most humbly and sincerely if by any stretch of the imagination I might give the impression that I consider myself a survivor. You, and only you, have the right to call yourselves survivors with a capital S. So that was the main reason why I did not write a book about the Kindertransport long ago. Sometimes I would jot down little vignettes which I thought might one day be of interest to my grandchildren. Some of those articles were actually published in a couple of obscure publications. But then a few years ago, I saw the documentary Into the Arms of Strangers. How many of you saw the documentary? Anybody? Just a few. The film was extremely well done and certainly deserved the Oscar it received. But personally, I was disappointed. I was disappointed because all the people portrayed in the documentary who had been on the Kindertransport had come from secular homes. Not one of them had been brought up in an Orthodox home. And what actually upset me even more was that the producer, Diane Oppenheim, never mentioned the person who almost single-handedly rescued more than 1,000 children out of the total of 10,000, as Ruthie said, who were brought into England on the Kindertransport, namely Rabbi Solomon Schoenfeld of blessed memory. Those 1,000 children, like me, all came from Orthodox homes. So it was then that I decided to try and set the record straight with respect to Rabbi Schoenfeld. At the same time, I also thought it was important to show how much greater the trauma of the experience was for a child brought up Orthodox as against a child who had never observed the Shabbat, had been used to eating non-kosher food at home, had gone to school with Gentiles, and had rarely, if ever, seen the inside of a synagogue. Most of you are too young to remember World War II. So I'll just give a short recap about the genesis of the Kindertransport. In March of '38, the Nazis marched into Austria to cheering, welcoming crowds and annexed the country. That was called the Anschluss, which is the German word for annexation. The Jews, including my parents, were forced onto their hands and knees to scrub the streets. My father was a Rav, and his shtibel was ransacked, and the Torah scrolls, the Sifrei Torah, the Siddurim, and Chumashim were all thrown onto a bonfire in the middle of our street and burnt. In October of the same year, the Germans marched into the Sudetenland and annexed that part of Czechoslovakia. So certainly the Jews of Austria and Czechoslovakia, and of course Germany, where there were already some detention camps like Dachau, the Jews in those countries knew that the future for them was not looking too good, and they saw the writing on the wall. Meanwhile, back at the ranch in England, Neville Chamberlain was making nice to Hitler. How many of you remember him coming off the plane, waving that piece of paper, "Peace in our time"? And Hitler, in turn, wanting to make nice to the Brits and wanting to calm them into a false sense of security, agreed to allow transports of Jewish children to leave if the British government was willing to accept them. Incidentally, the American government was also asked to accept Jewish children. And in case any of you are still harboring any fond feelings for the Roosevelt administration, let me tell you what its policy was in that respect. At that time, the man in charge of refugee affairs was that notorious anti-Semite Assistant Secretary of State Breckinridge Long. And the word came back that America would not accept any Jewish children from Europe because, are you ready for this? Children belong with their parents. My father had heard that there was a young rabbi in England by the name of Solomon Schofield, who under the auspices of the Aguda organization was arranging to bring transports of children from Austria to England. My father managed to secure 4 places on one of those transports for me and my 3 older siblings. I believe ours was the second transport to leave Austria. Incidentally, some transports landed up in Holland and never got to England. My father made very sure that our final destination was England. I imagine that his insistence saved our lives. I met a man in Los Angeles recently who had come to England on the Kindertransport from Frankfurt. He told me that his 2 younger sisters had been sent by their mother to an aunt in Holland. To this day, he has no idea what happened to them. When we arrived in England, I was sent to live with a Jewish family in the East End of London. Because of the frantic rush to get as many children as possible out of Europe, and as quickly as possible, it was not always possible for Rabbi Schofield to screen the families as carefully as he would have liked. As a result, I ended up with a family that was not strictly Orthodox. They kept a kosher home, and the father took me and their 2 sons to shul every Shabbos, but then in the afternoon we were taken to the movies. I started 1st grade, and after 2 months, not only was I speaking English, but I had forgotten all my German and Yiddish. On September 1, 1939, Hitler's armies invaded Poland. Because England had a non-aggression pact with Poland, on September 3rd, England declared war on Germany. Naturally, all the Kindertransport operations immediately ceased. It was now expected that England would be attacked and that specifically London would be bombed. It was therefore considered a priority by the British government to get the children out of London. I was evacuated to the countryside together with a bunch of other kids from my school and ended up living with 3 Gentile families. My sister Miriam also ended up with a Gentile family, while my brother was lucky. As soon as we arrived in England, he was sent to live in a hostel for Orthodox boys in Cardiff, Wales. My older sister ended up in Manchester, where she lived with an aunt who had managed to get out of Vienna at around the same time we did. Eventually, the boys' hostel where my brother was living in Cardiff agreed to open its doors to girls, and my sister went to live there. They both tried to get me there also, but the family with whom I had lived in London was still in charge of me and refused to let me go. As a result, my sister, who was not yet 15, kidnapped me. The London family were very angry, and they sent the police to see if I had been coerced into coming to Cardiff, or if I had gone of my own free will. Obviously, I told the police that I was very happy to be with my sister and brother after not being together for almost 3 years. When the Cardiff hostel closed down, probably because they ran out of money, Rabbi Schoenfeld sent me to the village of Shefford in Bedfordshire, where his Jewish day school had been evacuated in its entirety at the outbreak of the war. The school had been founded by the rabbi's late father, Victor Schoenfeld, and I believe it was the first Orthodox Jewish day school of its kind in England. I have devoted the longest section of my book to the Shefford experience, because it really deserves a book of its own. Actually, Dr. Judith Grumfeld, our headmistress, did write a book entitled Shefford, a copy of which I have, but hers was written from the point of view of one of the staff, whereas my account is obviously through the eyes of a former student. I probably have not done the Shefford experience justice, because I was only there for the last 2 years of the war, whereas the biggest adjustment to life in a Gentile English village whose inhabitants had never seen a Jew before obviously occurred at the beginning of the war. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. We were all brought back to London and continued attending Rabbi Schoenfeld's school, where our headmistress was still Dr. Judith Grumfeld. Incidentally, Dr. Grumfeld's husband was Diane Isidore Grumfeld, who translated and published the English translation of Shamshon Raphael Hirsch's famous work, The Horeb. We adjusted to life in London and waited to hear the fate of our parents. All our inquiries through the Red Cross met a dead end. Our parents had made it as far as Yugoslavia and then disappeared into thin air. In December of 1949, I made Aliyah and lived and worked in Israel for 2.5 years, after which time I came back to London. In 1955, I emigrated to the States. It was not until 1973, long after I was married, and after Len and I and our children had moved to Los Angeles, that we learned the fate of our parents. A mass grave had been discovered in Yugoslavia. The always efficient Germans had a list, and on it were the names of 200 Viennese Jews, including my parents and my paternal grandmother. I want to conclude my talk with just a few words about Rabbi Solomon Schoenfeld, Zechrono Livrocha, after which I hope we have time for any questions you may have. I have found that more information about the Kindertransport is elicited through questions than through my presentation. When I first met the rabbi in Holland on our way to England from Vienna, he was a young man of 26, unmarried, and talk about charismatic. I've never since met anyone with that kind of charisma, charm, forcefulness, and sheer personality. We were given a hot meal in the school after our train journey through Germany, and Rabbi Schoenfeld went around the room and said something to each child. When he came to me, he asked me if I spoke Yiddish. I said, of course. And he asked me to say something. For some reason, the only thing I could think of was the phrase that became the title of my book, "Throw your feet over your shoulders, over your shoulders." Neem de fies of de pleitses en Leuf. Over the years, Rabbi Schoenfeld always took great pleasure in reminding me of that every time I met him. Rabbi Schoenfeld was born in England, but because there were no yeshivas in England at the time where serious rabbinic students could go, he was sent to study in the famous yeshiva of Nitra in Czechoslovakia, where he received his smicha. At the yeshiva, he came under the influence of a most remarkable man, Rabbi Michael Ber Weissmandl. When war loomed on the horizon, it was Rabbi Weissmandl who urged Rabbi Schoenfeld to get involved with rescuing Jews from Europe. Rabbi Schoenfeld's rescue operations did not end when the Kindertransport ended. Throughout the war, he continued smuggling Jews out of Europe. And after the war, at great risk to his life, he often traveled to the East European countries where desperate parents had left their children for safekeeping in convents and monasteries and with Gentile families, while they themselves perished. It was not always easy for Rabbi Schoenfeld to pry the children away from those places. He would go into the convents and monasteries, and when he saw a group of children, he would start to recite the Shema. And some of those children, hearing those familiar words, were reminded of their parents and homes and came running to him. In 1940, Rabbi Schoenfeld married the daughter of the then chief rabbi of the British Empire, of which Canada is a part, Rabbi Hertz. It was rumored that one of the main reasons he married Judith Hertz, was so that he could use his father-in-law's influence with the British government as chief rabbi to help him in his rescue operations. Thank you for listening. And now if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
If you have a question, please stand up and raise your hand so we can recognize you. Susan?
I'm trying to visualize throw your feet over your shoulders. What does it mean?
What does throw your feet over your shoulders mean?
It sort of means throw your feet over just get out of here. Take your legs and get out of here.
Other questions? Just we should point out that the Kindertransport was not a uniquely Orthodox endeavor. As a matter of fact, out of the 10,000 approximate children who were saved from Germany and Vienna, only 1,000 of them were Orthodox children. That was Rabbi Schoenfeld's effort.
I just want to add that after writing my book, I learned that Eleanor Roosevelt, in conjunction with the Quakers of this country, did bring about 5,000 children into this country. And into the U.S. Into the U.S. That number varies depending on who I'm speaking to. Some people have told me 10,000, but I think the number is closer to 5,000. And some kids of the other 9,000 children that were brought in, besides the 1,000 that Rabbi Schoenfeld brought in, were Orthodox. Just that they didn't manage to get on Rabbi Schoenfeld's transport.
Questions?
Rabbi?
Yes.
Korobkin. I'm just curious, as a child, what kind of impact, if any, did the experience have on your faith, both at the time and even today?
The question is, what did the experience on the Kindertransport have on your faith, both at the time and today?
I can't remember what effect it had on me at the time. I was too busy living. I was a child. But it's a very good question and a very loaded question. Anytime my faith wavered over the years, angry, whatever, especially what teenagers go through, there were two things, many things, but two especially that I think kept my faith. One was that I knew without question that my parents had gone to their death with the Shema on their lips. And the second was that any time I did waver, I realized that Judaism, Orthodox Judaism, was my lifeline. That the words we say on Shabbos, Eitz Chaim Hi, the Machazikim Bo, are not empty words. They're true.
But it was also, Mom, your experiences after the war which helped form perhaps your specific hashkafot, your specific religious ideologies because of some of the encounters that you had after the war.
Right.
Do you want to say anything about that?
Well, the shepherd experience that I write about in my book, where I came under the influence of the German Hashkafa of Shimshon Raphael Hirsch that talked about Torah and Derech Eretz, having a secular education, not being contradictory to an Orthodox education, definitely helped me. And I must say that things have gone much more to the right since then, as we have experienced with, as I'm sure you have all experienced with your children, with yeshivas. In those days, we all sang together, boys and girls. There was a mixed choir at Shepherd. I sang in the choir despite my voice. And it really was a wonderful experience. Everybody was encouraged to go to school. We didn't have a lot of facilities like laboratory facilities for kids to study chemistry, and yet a lot of the boys became doctors. Don't know how it happened, how we were motivated. We didn't have parents to show our report cards to, but we were motivated, and there were even a couple of members of parliament in England who were on the Kindertransport. And there was a lady here who came, what's her last name? Dimmerstein, who came here for our bar mitzvah, for Yoshi's bar mitzvah, whose father was on the Kindertransport and who won a Nobel Prize for chemistry.
I wouldn't start looking for the mixed choir at the BAYT anytime. But I just wanted to point out that the reason I was asking is because my mother's parents, my mother's father was a Vishnitzer Chassid, and the family sort of polarized. My mother's entire family is Satmar today in London, and my mother pulled away from that and made Aliyah to a kibbutz.
I didn't go to a kibbutz.
You didn't go to
that we are also the children of Holocaust survivors, my husband and myself. And my mother-in-law went to Auschwitz, and she was saved by Josef Notenwinkel 3 times. She was in line, and so it's a long story. But anyway, she never spoke about this to my husband, but she told me everything. and so did my mother, and so did my whole family. My question to you is, obviously you don't discuss every detail with your son, do you discuss it with your grandchildren? Do you go into details? Do you make the experience come alive because it's very, very important, as you know, older generations, much older than you are, disappearing. So we need to know it, and we need to, do you discuss it with your children?
I only do so in answer to questions, specific questions. And that's actually one of the reasons I wrote the book. My children will have that as a Euroshow.
David.
What happened to your siblings?
They're in London. They all live in London and married. My brother's wife unfortunately passed away several years ago. He had a very successful marriage. He married a girl from Gateshead. His father was a Rothenberg from the Antwerp Rothenbergs, and they had many children, and my brother has many, many grandchildren and great-grandchildren. My sister married a Satama Fawcett, who is head of the Natura Carta in London. And my claim to fame. And my other sister, my older sister, also still lives in London. She was also widowed many years ago.
Also something you shouldn't expect at the BAYT. Yes.
What did your parents say to you when you left?
What did my parents...
What advice did your parents...
Do you remember anything that your parents said to you before you left?
I don't recall anything specific. Maybe my older siblings do, but I don't. Sorry.
There's a very poignant passage in the book where you talk about walking with your father.
Yeah, to the train.
To
Well, in my book, I describe how my father walked us to the train station, and on the way, some Germans in uniform threw him up against the wall and cut off his beard.
Yes, Suzanne.
I think I asked you yesterday, and you said to me that I asked today, how did you come to go to Los Angeles? What brought you? You went, to England, then to Israel, and then back to England, and then...
How did we get to LA?
How did you get to New York? Well, how did you get to America?
How'd you get to a big business?
Well, I was working for an international trading company that you may have heard of, Philip Brothers. I was working for their London branch when I came back from Israel, and the head of the New York branch, New York main office, happened to be on the visit, and I was very adventurous, and I wanted to get out of England, and I said to him, "Would you have a job for me?" And he said, "Sure." So my aunt, who was alive at the time, sent me an affidavit, and that's how I got to New York. And then, as far as Los Angeles is concerned, my husband was working at the time for ABC Entertainment, and they sent him out as an attorney, and they sent him to Los Angeles, and I followed him.
Together with the kids. Yeah.
I know you were young when you left Europe. Have you returned to Vienna to the homestead, and what sort of feelings did it arouse, although you were very, very young when you left?
Question is, have you gone back to Vienna?
Yes, I described in the book how my husband and I went to Vienna to visit the mass grave. The grave that was found in Yugoslavia was disinterred by the Chevra Kadisha in Vienna and reburied halachically in the Vienna cemetery, Jewish cemetery, and we went back once to visit.
And what was your feeling when you were there?
I was very agitated to be in Vienna. I couldn't wait to get out.
Yes.
Separated from your siblings association or soccer. What made
question is, how did you separate from the rest of the family, and who did you affiliate with?
I don't know what you mean by affiliate with.
Well, your siblings are ones that has associated with Satmar, but you did not.
Oh, because of the experiences during the war. We were separated, everybody went to a different family, and because it was wartime. And my sister did not want to be, my middle sister did not want to be separated from me. My parents had told her to take care of me, but circumstances being what they were, she was sent to one family, I was sent to another. And she married at the age of 16. She had hoped to make a home for me and my brother. Didn't quite turn out that way. But as I said, my experiences during the war in Shefford sort of shaped my Hashkafa.
Yes?
My aunt and uncle were also in Kindertransport from Germany. And my mother at the time was the same age as you were, 6 years old, and her parents decided not to let her go. So they fled to Holland, and they were in Holland, and then they ended up in Westerbork, as most of the Dutch Jews did. But my aunt still had a contact with the people that housed her. She went to Harrow. There was a girls' home in Harrow. Did you maintain contact with the people that, say, put you up during the war?
Are you still in touch? Yeah.
You're still in touch with them?
Am I still in touch with any of the people? No, I'm not. I was for a while, but those things peter out.
Yeah.
I have a question. My father is a survivor also, and it fascinates me. How did your parents, if you know the answer, get your name on the Kindertransport list? Most others didn't have options.
Question is, how did your parents get your name on the Kindertransport list?
It was through the Aguda. My father had heard about the Kindertransport, and I guess through his connections as a Rav. I'm not sure exactly how that worked.
You mind relating exactly what happened? So you had this world gathering in England, and so about, the children.
1998. I had alluded to it when the chief rabbi was here. So the question is, what's my mom's experience at the 60th anniversary of the Kindertransport?
It was an incredible experience. 1,300 people attended, Kindertransport survivors with their spouses and with children. I went with my 2 sons. My daughter was invited to come along also, but she felt it would just be too emotional. And it was a very emotional experience. But in a way, I was disappointed because most of the people, from the Orthodox community, very few people attended the reunion. It was mostly from the secular community. Although one of the main organizer, forgotten her name, Bertha something, she was Orthodox, and I think she recently made Aliyah. But it was an extremely, extremely emotional experience, and your son-in-law may be able to tell you more about it.
Yeah, there's plenty of stories, I'll tell you one day.
Mrs. Korobkin, do you recall your father's last words when he was walking you to the train?
No, I'm afraid I don't.
The question I have, at the time when you said goodbye to your parents, did you feel that they're abandoning you, or did you realize at that time that this is for your own benefit? Do you recall what... Was
there a feeling of abandonment from your parents?
This is basically the question that I was expecting and that I'm identifying now. People ask me if I resented my parents because I felt abandoned. I never felt that. First of all, we were told we were going on an adventure. And I couldn't understand why everybody was so upset. My mother was crying, my grandmother who lived with us, she was crying. Why were they crying? So as a 6-year-old, your perspective is a lot different than it is as an adult or even as an older child. So I never felt abandoned. I always felt in awe of parents, like my parents, who were able to do that. Because I don't know how any of us in this room would react. If God forbid we were under those circumstances.
Yes, Ruthie Posner.
Is that the real Ruthie?
Two things. First of all, where was this reunion? And second of all, why do you think so few Orthodox people showed up?
Where was the reunion, and why do you think that so few Orthodox Jews showed up?
The reunion was at the University of London. I have no idea why so few. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they felt that orthodoxy, that the place wouldn't be orthodox enough. I have no idea. It so happened that my son organized Shacharis and Maariv, Mincha and Maariv services at the reunion, and everything was strictly kosher. It didn't take place over Shabbos, it was during the week, it was like 3 days during the week. I have no idea why not more. I did have a couple of friends, old friends that I hadn't seen for, I don't know, 45, 50 years, who did come, but it was disappointing to me. Like my sisters and my brother would never dreamed of coming to an event like that, especially men and women sitting together.
What percentage of those 1,000 kids that Rabbi Schoenfeld put together, what percentage of them do you think remained from?
That's a very good question. I have no way of knowing how to answer that. The ones I know are all from. I don't know any of my friends who were in Shefford who have not remained from.
Frank?
There was no mention made at all of the Zionist movement at that time in your talk. And I wonder, because some of them were giving the same message that is the title of your book, in fact. Zev Jabotinsky was pleading with European Jewry to leave. The Blau-Weiß organization in Austria was of the same opinion. Why did that message not resonate? And a supplementary to that, because you lived through those difficult times, how do you view the circumstances now for the Jewish people in terms of the threats and the voices that, again, are there?
Boy, that's some question. First of all, there are a lot of people who did want to leave and couldn't. Financially, they had no money. Or they were, like my parents, stateless. My parents were actually from Poland. And you know, that part of Galicia kept changing sides. Sometimes the Germans owned it, sometimes Austria owned it, sometimes Poland owned it. I don't know what was going on. A lot of people wanted to leave and just couldn't. Or they had, my mother, for instance, did not leave at the same time as my father to Yugoslavia because she wouldn't leave my grandmother who was living with us. It was only after my grandmother was deported to Theresienstadt that my mother left and joined my father in Yugoslavia. As to what I believe today, unfortunately I believe it could happen. Certainly in the United States, maybe not in Canada. You have a different government. I think it could happen. We see signs of it all the time, unfortunately.
What could happen?
What could happen in 1938 could happen in the United States. That's what I think.
Yes, Roberta.
Do you know of any children who were actually reunited with their parents?
The question is, do you know of any children who were reunited with their parents?
Yes, but very few, and sometimes just with one parent.
Yes, I'm sorry. There was a lady at the same table. Yes. Oh, yes.
I'm Joanne from the Jewish Tribune. I was wondering if you could just explain for me what you were just saying about what happened in 1938 can happen in the United States but not Canada. Could you just sort of clarify what you meant by that?
Clarification.
Okay. For instance, at the Occupy Wall Street movement downtown in the financial sector, a woman got up and in front of the microphones, it was on the news, said she feels that all the Jews, all the Zionists should leave the country, go back where they came from. And this kind of thing has been going on in the United States. It's hashed up. There are a lot of incidents of shuls and Jewish establishments being vandalized, and unfortunately it's getting more and more frequent.
There was excuse me. There was about 3 years ago, there was a terror cell in a prison in Southern California that already had the blueprints of one of the shuls on Pico Boulevard that had been targeted for terrorism attack. And so, a lot of the people are radicalized, are converted to radical Islam in prison and are plotting terror attacks as we speak. So we have to be very vigilant. Jordan.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the expectation or the families that took you in, and I'm extrapolating of course, but were they treating you as one of their children? Did the children and the family relate to you in the same way, or was there a certain distance involved or the expectation that you were going to eventually go back to your family or go elsewhere? Were you temporary or more permanent?
How did the families treat you, more as one of the members of the family or just as a temporary resident? And perhaps part two, if I could, Jordan, is if you could, did you feel more welcome in the Jewish homes or in the non-Jewish homes?
Sadly, my experience in the Jewish home in London was not a good one. I had a much better experience with two of the Gentile families that I lived with during the war. But that's just how it turned out. I've heard stories of children who landed up in Jewish homes where they practically, adopted them when they found out after the war that the parents hadn't survived, sent them through school. It just depended on the family. I did not have a good experience.
There's a story that I plan to tell at some point, I may tell it tonight at the NCSY event, about Sir Richard Attenborough, whose family, who was a non-Jew, a very famous director and producer, whose family took in 2 girls from the Kindertransport and had a very, very positive experience. Yes, Masha.
Would you happen to know how many descendants there are of the children who were saved in the transport?
How many descendants?
It's impossible to say, but thank God there are thousands. There's no way I could enumerate that.
Yes.
My name is Lana Wood. I just wanted to know, were you embarrassed by having to break Shabbos? You were a little girl, you came from home, and you weren't the only one who had to go through this, Gentile homes and lesser from homes that you're placing. Were you embarrassed by it?
How did you feel about having to break Shabbos?
Oh, by the way, do you think that a lot of people who remain very religious are embarrassed to admit that they went through that as well?
I'm not embarrassed. I felt guilty at the time, and I described that in my book. My sister Miriam, who was with the Gentiles also for a while during the war, will not discuss it. Everybody, I guess, has a different feeling about it. I'm not embarrassed about it.
And you have a great Christmas story, don't you?
In the book, I describe how I spent Christmas. Well,
I want to live vicariously.
You're not going to want to read my book if I tell all the stories. The first Gentile family I was with, they had a Christmas tree, and I must tell you, it's a wonderful. I had a great time. it was a wonderful experience, all those presents under the tree and the thing lit up. And I used to go to Sunday school, to church, and the maid, I describe in my book how the maid, the people, they were childless, and they had a maid, Annie, and she used to take me to church, and she told me that if on a clear night, if you look up in the sky, you'll see the saints sitting on their thrones. And I used to look. Never saw any saints. Never saw any saints.
Did you leave out cookies on Christmas Eve?
No, I left out my stocking, my stocking at the end of the bed, and in the morning it was stuffed with presents.
Not to teach to your children. Yes. Susie.
Were you aware of what was going on in the rest of Europe during those years? And did you think about your parents at that time?
Were you apprised of what was going on during the war?
I did not know anything about the concentration camps as a child. It wasn't until towards the end of the war that we learned about, we saw the newsreels when they were liberated and learned what was happening. I knew the first family I lived with, the Gentile family, he had been a colonel in the First World War, and he kept a map with the progress of the war, with little pins, blue and red pins showing the progress of the war. So from that point of view, I remember Dunkirk. Do anybody remember what Dunkirk was? When the British soldiers were stranded in France, and the British sent even rowboats to rescue them. So those kind of milestones I have a vague memory of. And whatever I didn't remember, I made up.
We're going to take one last question. Go ahead.
I'm second generation a Holocaust survivor. My mother was a hidden child. What advice do you have, given the rise of anti-Semitism today and the rise of assimilation today? What advice do you have for parents and third generation to be in touch and to be aware that this could happen again?
So the question is, what advice practically would you give to second generation as survivors, as parents of the third generation of the survivors, in light of the looming dangers that may exist?
I'm not that smart. What advice could one give? I feel it was a matter of luck for us that our children stayed on the derech. Could have gone anyway. And just do your best as parents. And as far as how to stop it from happening again, I'm not that smart. I'm sorry.
Rabbi.
I should also point out, just one second, I should also point out that one of the, it's altogether possible that the reason why we're from today is not just luck, but also because of your insistence, especially because you didn't have parents, that you felt the need to preserve what they stood for, and make sure that your children would carry through with it. Okay, so what I'd like to do, I'm sorry, but just because the hour is late, my mother is still available. She's going to be here for a few more days, and you're always welcome to speak with her. And just wanted to thank everyone for coming this morning. And there's whatever's left, please enjoy. The books are at the back table. And we're going to bench. And I just wanted to say finally a big yishar koach to Dr. Melech Tannen and Elaine Genesov. It's truly an honor to be able to welcome my parents and my in-laws to see our new home here at the BAYT. And I thank you all for the tremendously warm outpouring of welcome that you've extended to them and to our entire family and to all of our friends. Part of the bonus of welcoming my parents is that my mom recently authored a book, a sort of a memoir, about her experiences after the Kindertransport, and that's what she's going to talk about today. But first I'd like to be able to extend a tremendous thanks to all of the sponsors for today's breakfast. Our sponsors today are Shai and Robin Berglass, Ashley and Lisa Berman, Frank and Florence Diamond, Jack and Harriet Feintuch, Alan and Tova Guttenberg, Craig and Esther Gutman, Zach and Suzanne Kay, David and Hannah Klein, Michael and Ruthie Mammon, Morris Marin, Ephraim and Ruthie Posner, Michael and Lillian Rendy, Mel and Karen Rahm, Jerry and Ann Talinsky, and Larry and Susan Zeitman. Thank you so much. I'd now like to call upon Ruthie Klein.
Thank you for sharing your mother with us, because the Simcha today gave us all the opportunity to hear about her. I think that when during my work, I come across many stories and testimonies and autobiographies of Holocaust survivors, whether they're talking about harrowing experiences in concentration camps, whether they were hidden children, or whether they managed to escape by any means, including the Kindertransport. And both professionally and personally, as a child of a Holocaust survivor, each one of them is unique to me. And I'm always in awe of an author like Mrs. Frieda Korobkin, who can put her experiences down in a way that will have such resonance for people. People like us who here in Canada today really can have very little conception of what those times were like and the choices that had to be made. The history that Mrs. Korobkin recounts, her story begins with the horrors of Nazi rule in Europe and the escape on the Kindertransport. Kindertransport, a special scheme that the British government that allowed 10,000 unaccompanied children and babies into England. An act of chesed, of course, but one should always remember that this was a temporary measure. This was not exactly open-armed, and there were heavy financial guarantees arranged by the Jewish community and other religious communities in Britain so that these orphans, as some of them were to be, would not be a charge on the state. So every act of generosity seemed to have a little bit of another side to it. Imagine the choice of her parents, a 6-year-old, those of us who are parents here in this room, the choice between your 6-year-old staying with you, or obviously you want your child to be, or giving her the chance of safety to send her away literally into the arms of strangers. And that's what it was. I think we have to remember those times and remember the specific challenges that people faced. But even in England, another upheaval, the evacuation of nearly 2 million children to safety because of the Blitz, the relentless bombing of London and other cities in England, 2 million children on the move. And some of these children, Jewish, from being sent to places where they had never seen a Jew and did not understand the special needs and sensitivities. Everyone's experiences were different, and we're going to hear about Mrs. Korobkin's now. But I think what got me about her particular book is the utter honesty with which she describes these particular challenges that Jewish children faced, especially religious children, and the compromises at times that had to be made in order to get through those awful years.